Hello, my name is Mark MacLeod, and I'm recording a talk that I gave last week on the Isle of Raasay in Scotland. My talk is about how to use DNA to learn about the genealogy of MacLeods from Raasay. The two pictures tell the story of two different MacLeods. MacLeods living in relative comfort, the chiefs in the castle or Raasay house right there, and other MacLeods and other people living in townships such as Manish, who were cleared from their land many times by the clan chiefs themselves. You have to wonder whether there was any relationship between the MacLeods living in the castle and MacLeods living in townships such as Manish. I started my family research a few years ago when I wanted to learn more about James MacLeod, my great-great-grandfather. There he is there in Prince Edward Island, circa 1890. He was born in Inverness Shire, which is a very large county in Scotland, not very specific. I always thought, and the family always thought, he came from the Isle of Skye. I've taken my boys to Dunvegan Castle and said, this is where our forefathers once lived. He was a successful tailor, perhaps evidenced by the clothes he's wearing. He was married twice, each time to an Irish Catholic woman, which I think is important. I'll speak to that later. So my questions were, where in Scotland, where in Inverness Shire was he from? Who were his parents? Did he have any siblings? And could DNA, relatively new on the scene, could DNA help answer these questions? So in my talk today, I'll talk about three main points: the types of DNA tests, and then I'll talk about using DNA to help find my family roots. I italicized the word help because DNA is just one tool of many tools that a genealogist will use to build family trees. Let me say, I'm not a professional genealogist. I'm learning the techniques of genetic genealogy using DNA. I'll then talk about the genealogy of MacLeods from Raasay, guided by a type of DNA test called Y-DNA. So looking at MacLeods from Raasay and Rona, it's a very common surname. Here, looking at 1841 census, we see from 1,100 people, we see that MacLeod is by far the most common surname on the island. There are MacLeod chiefs and people living on the island named MacLeod. We also see the second most common surname is Mackenzie, third MacLean both at about 10%, and Gillies, MacLennan, McSwain, McCrae, Nicholson, etc. The upshot of all that is MacLeods will often marry MacLeods or those related to MacLeods. And even if a MacLean and a Mackenzie got married, in their family tree, there will be MacLeods more than likely from this particular area. And that'll complicate things when it comes to DNA analysis. And we'll see examples of that. So there are two main types of DNA tests that I'm going to talk about today. The first is called an autosomal DNA test. Companies such as Ancestry offer these that cost around 60 pounds. And it's estimated that 30 million people around the world have taken an autosomal DNA test. Men and women can take these tests and they'll find relatives on both your paternal side and your maternal side. They're useful for finding relatives perhaps 6, 7, maybe 8 generations back. And the reason for that is best explained by an analogy that I once read that compared the process of creating you to a father with a full deck of cards and a mother with a full deck of cards. To create you, they merged their decks of cards together and randomly threw away half the cards. So you're left with a full deck of DNA from your mother and DNA from your father. If you go on then to have a child, the same process happens and your child is left with DNA, about 25% of the DNA from your parents. So with each successive generation, we lose DNA from the older generations. These autosomal results can also be affected by close marriages and multiple common ancestors. And again, we'll see an example of that later. Y-DNA is a bit more powerful. It's more expensive. Companies such as Family Tree DNA in Houston offers that, but it's limited to men only. It's estimated that no more than 1 million men today have taken this test. And it will only find relatives on your paternal line. That is your father's line, father's father, father's fathers, etc. So, and it will determine your place on the tree of mankind. Let me try to briefly explain what it does. When a man is born, he inherits a Y chromosome from his father. That Y chromosome that he inherits from his father may contain a harmless mutation from his father. And now you have that Y chromosome with that mutation you got from your father, but you also have mutations from your father's ancestors along the paternal line. Every 100 years or so, a new mutation is added to the Y chromosome. And so you will have thousands of mutations in your Y chromosome. And geneticists have figured out approximately when those mutations happened and what population of people contain those particular mutations. And we'll see that a little later on towards the end of the talk. So there's no issues with close marriages. It's only looking at the paternal line, as I said. There's a third type of DNA test called a mitochondrial DNA test that men or women can take. It only looks at the maternal line. It's increasing in popularity, but the data set is still fairly small. So moving on to autosomal tests and the concept of DNA relatives. When you get your test back, you spit in a tube, you mail it off, you get it back about 6 weeks later. The most interesting information you get from that test, in my opinion, is a list of DNA matches. And my top 5 matches are shown there. My strongest match is my sister, Jen MacLeod, my niece and nephew from another sister, and 2 first cousins. Their match, the strength of the match is measured in something called centimorgans. And I've listed the centimorgan levels of my 5 strongest matches. My sister at 2,500, my 2 first cousins in the 700 to 800 range, and all makes sense. We're all related in that way. But a DNA match here, clearly a relative, and the closer the relative, the stronger the DNA match will be. That's all straightforward for these 5 people. But if I scroll down my match list, I find 2 people who are very interesting, and I'll explore them in more detail: Jan Emerson and Ross MacLeod. A very weak match to me, but as you'll see, they match family members. And in fact, 20 of my family members have taken this test, and I've used their results and studied their results for quite a long time, and I've started to learn some things. What did I learn? Well, many of these relatives have ties to Prince Edward Island. And as you recall, James lived in Charlottetown. A lot of them are documented in this book shown here, The MacLeods of Prince Edward Island. And many of these relatives have a branch of their tree that leads back in time to the Isle of Raasay. I was expecting Skye, but I found the Isle of Raasay. Let's look at 2 of those, the 2 I mentioned before. First, Jan Emerson, who matches 13 family members. Her family tree, at least the MacLeod side, is shown here. Jan lives in Texas. Her mother was Margaret MacLeod, and she leads back in time to Lachlan and Annie MacLeod, who they were both born on Raasay and died in PEI. I'd like to thank Norma MacLeod for finding Lachlan and Anne in the 1841 census from Raasay, here with 2 children, Kirsty and Donald. We roll forward 40 years later, we find this couple living on PEI in lot 31. And by this time, Donald has moved to New Brunswick and is not in the census there. So next is Ross MacLeod. He matches 17 of our family members. And so clearly a relative, got to figure out why. There's Ross. He lives and runs a photography business in British Columbia. We trace his family tree. There's lots of MacLeods. First of all, Alexander MacLeod. He was born on Raasay, died on PEI, and John MacLeod, same thing. Now, Ross has taken this Y-DNA test that, again, only looks at his paternal line, and that result shows that John is very closely related to my ancestor, James. Well, as you'll see in the next slide, John MacLeod and Alexander MacLeod were brothers. So here we have a fairly rare example of first cousins getting married. So how are we all related to Jan Emerson and et cetera? Well, there's a family that was documented many years ago that said Norman MacLeod and Isabel Mackenzie, two of the most popular surnames on Raasay in 1841. They married and had a family, seemingly only sons, but it included Alexander, John, and Lachlan. The note also says at the very bottom, there were other siblings unidentified. Well, DNA analysis confirms beyond a shadow of a doubt that James was one of those unidentified siblings. If you look at it in a family tree, here we have Norman and his born with at least 4 sons, Lachlan, John, Alexander, and my ancestor, James. James, you see, had 2 wives. The first wife, Anne Bulger, died young. He later on married Margaret Barnes, both of Irish Catholic descent, which I think led to the fact that he was unidentified. I imagine marrying out of the faith created a bit of an issue back at that time in PEI. So I showed you 2 examples of DNA matches leading to these relatives. In fact, I have close to 100. I have found 30 relatives leading to Lachlan, 22 to John, and 40 to Alexander. And I've learned that most of this family, not Lachlan, but most left in 1839. And the question now becomes, who's Norman's parents? How does Norman fit in the overall Raasay family tree, if you will? So we came up with the idea. I was working with Rebecca Mackay, asking her these kinds of questions, and we came up with the idea to have a number of people living on Raasay today to have their DNA tested. And lo and behold, we have DNA relatives on Raasay. Perhaps not a surprise, but we had 5 MacLeods. 5 MacLeods have been tested from different families, different MacLeod families on Raasay. Donald, Sandy, Neil, Donnie, and Audrey Patterson now. Here's Sandy, Donnie, and Audrey. And they all have Raasay ancestry going back 200 plus years. And lo and behold, they match members of my family shown here in blue. The top 3 or 4 are the more senior members of my family, and they match everybody. These are MacLeods in different lines, but they all match. So the question is, how can my family be at the same time related and tied to all of these different MacLeod lines? And what's happening here, as I'll try to explain in the next slide or so, is I'm running into issues and limits with autosomal DNA in a place like Raasay. And the issue is best shown by observing that people who live on Raasay today with Raasay ancestry often show unusually high DNA match levels. And the example is Callum Don Mackay and Sandy MacLeod, who match at 864 centimorgans, typical of first cousins. They're not first cousins. Their closest common ancestor is a fellow named gray-haired Allen, born in the early 1800s, would make them third cousins. And third cousins, you'd expect to have a match level of about 73 centimorgans. What's going on? Well, that's not their only common ancestor. They have 7 more common ancestors, some of whom are repeated multiple times in their family tree. And that leads to that high match level. So Cal and Don and Sandy are not only third cousins, they're third cousins once removed, fourth cousins, et cetera. So it's what we're seeing here is MacLeod DNA from multiple related lines converging on Cal and Don and Sandy which makes them a very strong match related to the MacLeods, but it's from different common ancestors, some of them actually who are the same and probably related. So now I'm going to shift to Y DNA, and Y DNA is not affected by, as I said, multiple common ancestors. And I'm going to start with the genealogy of the first MacLeods by most published accounts. The progenitor of the clan is well accepted to be Loud, born around the 1200s. He had a son called Tormont, who was viewed to be the first chief of Harrison-Dunvegan, a son called Murdo, who had a son called Torkel Og MacLeod, the first chief of Lewis, born in the early 1300s. If we go several generations below Torkel Og, we find Torkel Du, who had his head removed on orders of his brother in 1597. Again, along a slightly different line, several generations below Torkel Og, we have Malcolm MacLeod, viewed as the first MacLeod of Raasay, and below Malcolm was a long succession of MacLeod of Raasay clan chiefs. So Torkel Du, let me go back to Torkel Du and tell a story about Torkel that really is in the category of oral tradition. There's no paper records to support it. It was passed down from generation to generation. And I'm paraphrasing from one of Rebecca's books. And it was an interview from the late poet Sorley MacLean to Ewan MacLeod, who lived on Raasay. And Sorley asked Ewan, which of the 5 unrelated, apparently unrelated MacLeod families from Raasay did Ewan belong to? And Ewan replied in Gaelic, which is to be expected, "It is not of the people of Raasay we were at all. We came from Lewis, from Torkel Du, who was hanged." Well, I think he had his head removed, but that's neither here nor there. And Sorley then wondered if Ewan really knew what he was saying. Could Ewan have been the rightful chief of the MacLeods of Lewis? Well, we're very fortunate that Neil MacLeod, and I showed Neil's autosomal DNA results earlier. Neil MacLeod is a grandson of Ewan, and he's not only tested with Ancestry, but we've had a Y-DNA test on Neil MacLeod. So now I'm going to move into Y-DNA results, and the results are collected into a project at Family Tree DNA, and where we have several hundred MacLeods who have taken the Y-DNA test. Some have tested at different levels from others, but we can see their Y-DNA and place them on the tree of mankind. So I'm looking at MacLeods in the tree of mankind, and I'm going to start with Adam of Africa. And if I roll forward in time, here I'm looking at way, way back in time, 16,000 BC, plus or minus a lot. We have a series of named Y-DNA mutations, I1A, I2A. The names are a bit awkward, but a mutation occurred in and about that time, and a whole group of people descend from I1A people, I2A, R1A people. And in the MacLeod project at FTDNA, again, several hundred members, we have 34 MacLeods who are have one of these 2 mutations in their Y chromosome, 27 MacLeods who are so-called R1A MacLeods. And one of those 34 people, by the way, is a Raasay, is a person with Raasay ancestry. He's a bit of an outlier, and we'll talk about that later, but perhaps there was a group of people back, way, way back in time, living close to the MacLeods, descendants of Loud, and perhaps they took on the surname for protection or whatever reason, and went on, and descendants came later. But if we come down the tree along the right side, we have R1B MacLeods and R1B people. These are tens of millions of people. 80% of Western European men have this particular mutation. I have it. Another branch off the R1B line it leads to another mutation, U106, 12 members of our MacLeod project, 12 people with the surname MacLeod are U106 MacLeods, another 40 are L21 MacLeods, before we get to Loud himself, whose mutation, or somebody very close to Loud, has a mutation that's been labeled BY3210. And there's 45 members of this MacLeod project who have that particular mutation and therefore are said to descend from Loud himself. And of those 45, 7 are Harrison Dunvegan MacLeods, and 36 are thought to descend from an early MacLeod of Lewis chief, Mr. FT6192. Love to have a name there, but that's just the nature of looking at these mutations on the Y chromosome. And lo and behold, there are 10 Raasay MacLeods, people with Raasay ancestry, who descend from Mr. FT6192. Let's look in more detail of that, but before we can summarize by saying most Raasay MacLeods descend from Loud and Lewis, unlike other MacLeods. There's over 100 people here on the left side who are MacLeods, but they don't descend from Loud. Okay, so let's zoom up on FT6192, thought to be an early clan chief of Lewis. He could be Torkel Og himself, we don't know. But the first person who is tested, who I call a Raasay MacLeod, is Malcolm Loudon Adair MacLeod. And he has a direct tie to the line of Raasay clan chiefs, first tying in with Loudon Hector MacLeod, the 15th chief, and on up the line to Alexander. And ultimately, he has this 6192 mutation, which makes sense from the genealogy slide I showed you. Raasay MacLeod clan chiefs descend from Lewis MacLeod clan chief. The next person is Neil MacLeod, and Neil, his grandfather was Ewan MacLeod, and Neil has a mutation labeled 108518. This mutation occurred about the time of Torkel Dub's birth. So maybe that is Torkel Dub. We don't know, thought to be on Lewis, but not sure. So all of that fits. Ewan said we're not of Raasay MacLeods at all. We descend from Torkel Dub, who descends, we know, from Torkel Og. So what doesn't fit is Sandy MacLeod from Raasay, who leads to red-haired Alan MacLeod, same as does Neil, 108518. So maybe Sandy also descends from Torkel Dub, or somebody very close in time to Torkel Dub. We bring in Donnie MacLeod, and both Donnie and Donald Malcolm have had their autosomal results. Here are Donnie's Y-DNA results in his family tree, and the paternal line is William. Same with Donald Malcolm. Donald Malcolm did not test, but I presume he would have the same mutation as Donnie, 19718. Another person, Kenneth Bethune, he has Raasay ancestry. One of his ancestors was Alistair MacLeod, born on Raasay in 1827. Same ancestor, distant ancestor as Donnie and Donald Malcolm, again, leading to Torkel Og, or somebody very close to Torkel Og. If we layer in my family, they're all shown here. I started on the left with Ross MacLeod. We said his distant paternal line led to John and then Norman. And in this case, there's a mutation, this 246597, that we can actually name. That is Norman himself. I have that same mutation, as does my great uncle Jim Allen MacLeod, and Neil MacLeod. His results just came in. He leads to Alexander. He has that same mutation. We then, before Norman, we have a mutation, a person from Lewis, based on other people's research, Mr. FT371272. Don't know who that is. Back in 1500s time frame. But again, we also share that 6192 mutation as along with all these other people. A couple of Raasay MacLeods I don't show here, but we can conclude that most Raasay MacLeods descend from Loud and Lewis based on Y-DNA tests. So to wrap things up, just in conclusion, I've shown you that autosomal DNA results were absolutely essential to discover my family's connection to Raasay, and I'm very proud to be a Raasay MacLeod. And most Raasay MacLeods descend from Loud and an early MacLeod of Lewis clan chief based on Y-DNA results. I'd like to thank Rebecca Mackay for considerable help and guidance over the years, and for arranging for these 5 Raasay people to be tested, and for Donnie, in particular Donnie, Sandy, Donald Malcolm Neal, and Callum Don Mackay for agreeing to have their DNA tested. And I believe you've added new insights into the genealogical history of the MacLeods. Thank you very much.